Hello, and welcome to the third lecture in our series of lectures for the lab on tissues. Today, what we're going to cover is connective tissue. So we're going to take a look at various types of connective tissue, just as we did when we were looking at epithelial tissue. And we'll start off with an examination of the functions and characteristics of connective tissue, which, as you will see, is quite a bit different than what we were looking at when we looked at epithelial tissue. So let's begin. And let's start off with, of course, the title of what we're covering, which would be connective tissue. And we're going to take a look at, first of all, this statement. It is going to be, when we look at the human body, the most abundant and widely distributed tissue in the human body. Yeah, it is. It makes up, in terms of the tissues that you're composed of, the four major tissues that you're composed of, this is the most abundant, and it's also the most widely distributed throughout your body. Let's take a look at its functions, and we'll get into some of the details after that. So functions, what does connective tissue do, or do, more than one, for our body? It, first of all, binds the body together. So something like a tendon would be a good example of that, binding muscle to bone, or a ligament binding bone to bone. So that's one of its functions. A second function will be support. So it supports the body. And soft tissue. So the entire body is supported by the skeletal system, which is one of the types of connective tissue that we have in our body. And we also can support within the body cavities, building a framework from bones, a supporting network for lots of the soft tissue that we have. Okay, so supports the body. A third function is it strengthens the body. It strengthens the body in a number of different ways. Again, we can look at skeletal tissue itself, bones, and we find throughout the body that type of connective tissue providing strength, but not just limited to bones. So dense connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, all of these play a role in strengthening different body parts and structures. So number 4, protects. And a classic example, of course, is the bones that surround the brain. That is a protective function, and we can go on and talk about many different examples of where bones are providing protection to soft tissue. Number 5, insulates. So it is insulating the body. Adipose tissue. There's a layer of adipose tissue just underneath the skin that helps to retain heat and insulates the body from loss of heat. That's just one example. Number 6. By the way, in terms of protection, it's not just hard tissue like bone, but we also use fat as a form of protection. So, for example, the kidneys are surrounded by a large and thick layer of fat to protect them. So it's not just the obvious protection that bones provide, but we see this protection in a variety of different ways. So protection, insulates. It's also involved in transportation. So it transports substances throughout the body. And the classic example here is blood, of course. Blood is a form of connective tissue, and it's transporting a number of different substances throughout the body. Number 7 on our list, it stores energy. And minerals. So I will turn to bone again. In terms of storing energy, so the inside of long bones, there's adipose tissue. Adipose tissue itself is a form of stored energy. And of course, minerals are being stored in bones as well. And number 8 is immunity. So here we can look at the blood. And within the blood, there are specialized blood cells that are all involved in the ability to protect ourselves from disease. So immunity. So those are the functions. Now, with that many functions, you would expect that there are a lot of different forms of connective tissue, and you would be right. So let's take a look at some of the characteristics, the general characteristics that define connective tissue, and then we'll look at specific types of connective tissue after we go through and identify the basic characteristics of connective tissue. So this would be characteristics of connective tissue. Number 1, it consists of 2 basic parts or elements. Number 1, cells. And number 2, something that we call the extracellular matrix. Often just simply simplified to matrix. So we have cells, and we have this extracellular material that we're referring to as a matrix. So that's the basic characteristic or construction, if you will, of all different types of connective tissue. Consist of these 2 basic elements. Second characteristic, it is that it is highly vascular. Okay. So it contains blood vessels. So there are some exceptions, and that is cartilage. Does not contain blood vessels within it. All the other types do. And we also have to take note that tendons have a very poor blood supply. So there are blood vessels within the tendons, but they're not very abundant, not like other types of connective tissue. So cartilage has none at all. Tendons has very little, or is not very vascular, I guess is a better way to put that. Number 3 is it contains nerves. So we do have innervation from the nervous system into connective tissue, with the exception, once again, of cartilage. So again, cartilage is an exception to the rule. Most all the other types of connective tissue, you will find nerves embedded within that tissue. Fourth is that unlike epithelial tissue, when we look at the cells, they are scattered. Remember, when we looked at epithelial tissue, they were closely packed together. This is not going to be the case with connective tissue. The cells are scattered about with a lot of extracellular material in between them. Right? And then number 5 there are many different types of cells. So when we looked at epithelial tissue, we saw, if it was simple cuboidal epithelium, what we saw was simple cuboidal or cuboidal shaped cells. If it was columnar, simple columnar, then we saw column-shaped cells. All of them look pretty much the same. This is not going to be the case here. We're going to get a lot of different types of cells. They're not going to be uniformly the same type of cell. And many of these characteristics we will see in the lab, but we're going to save the lecture for getting into the details and talking about, for example, what are the different types of cells. And we're not going to cover that here in the lab. Okay. So that's your connective tissue. Let's take a look at an image that shows us a typical view of connective systems, or connective tissue, excuse me. And probably want to have that in English and right side up. So here we go. So this is a typical connective tissue, and let's just go through and identify the elements. So first of all, what we said in terms of the characteristics, we have cells, scattered cells, in extracellular material. So as you can see, I've got some cells here, got some cells here, there, and there. And as you can see, they're scattered about and they're surrounded with other things like extracellular material. So the cells are different. We have plasma cells, we have mast cells, fibroblasts, eosinophils, macrophages, adipose cells. So a lot of variety of cells. They're not all the same. And then within the matrix, and let's go ahead and put that into our notes. So this matrix that we're talking about, so we have these scattered cells within a matrix. And the matrix is composed of two elements. Number one, fibers. And these are proteins. Okay. And number two, a ground substance. And it's the combination of different fibers and the specific type of ground substance which really defines the different kinds of connective tissue. We're not going to get into the fine details here in the lab. We will in the lecture. But when we talk about matrix, it is composed of these two elements. Fibers, which are proteins, and ground substance, which could be anything. For example, just some extremes, we can have mineral salts. And that would be bone. Or we could have a liquid such as water. That would be blood. Okay? So as you change the type of ground substance and you change the number, type, and arrangement of the fibers, you're producing different types of connective tissue. So let's get back to the image that we're looking at and look at that with that additional information. So as you can see, once again, we have the very different types of cells scattered about in the matrix, and then we can identify in this image the different kinds of fibers. So we have collagen fibers, that's the blue that you see here. Okay. And this is a highly schematic drawing. It's not very accurate in terms of what you would actually see under the microscope. We'll see some examples of that later on. We also have elastic fibers, and we also have collagen or reticular fibers. There we are, reticular fibers, which are the fine branching fibers that you see here. So we have the elastic fibers, which are brown here. We have the larger blue collagen fibers. So we have three different types of fibers, and then those fibers are enmeshed in the ground substance. And we'll talk about how or why that kind of construction is found in connective tissue. What does the combination of ground substance and fibers provide for connective tissue? Right now, we just want to make sure that we can identify some major types of connective tissue. So with this as a background, let's go ahead and look at our first example of connective tissue. And if you have your lab handout in front of you, you'll see that's areolar connective tissue. And well, I'll show you a better drawing than this, but this is a basic view of what areolar connective tissue is. And I'm going to go ahead and let you name these functions, find the answers to that. And in our lab, we'll come back and we'll address these questions. Not this week, which is week 4, but starting week 5, in the labs, we'll address all the questions that are in this study guide number 3. Okay, so we're going to take a look at areolar connective tissue first. And here it is. Now, as you look at this drawing, hopefully it reminds you of something. It might remind you, for example, of the last image we just looked at. So let's quickly come back to that image. And there's the image I'm referring to. We had that as a typical view of connective tissue. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this, which is a specific type of connective tissue, areolar connective tissue, and you might just see the strong similarity. So that last drawing I showed you could have been a drawing of areolar connective tissue, because that's our classic look for connective tissue. It's got the fibers, it's got the various different types of cells. You see the collagen fibers and the elastic fibers. It has the ground substance in between the cells, and has a variety of different cells, although they don't actually physically identify them. So in this case, they're using the subcutaneous layer just underneath the skin. So below, cutaneous referring to skin. Below the skin, there is a layer of areolar connective tissue, and it looks like this. Areolar connective tissue is sort of the glue of the body. If we want to glue things together, typically what's going to be used is areolar connective tissue. And that's certainly the case here, where we're looking at the gluing the skin to the underlying tissues below the subcutaneous layer, and it's acting as a glue to hold that onto the body. It's doing that in a number of different places throughout the body. So this is your typical view of areolar connective tissue. A second type of connective tissue that we're going to look at is adipose tissue. So adipose tissue, as you can see here, consists of very large cells, and each of the cells is filled up with a great big droplet of triglycerides. Now those triglycerides are contained within a vesicle, but that vesicle contains or fills up most of the cell itself. So let's take a look excuse me, at what that would look like. So here is a typical view of adipose tissue. So here, this kind of breaks the rule. Remember we said we're going to see a lot of scattered cells? Well, we're not as densely packed as you saw with the epithelial tissue, but we're still pretty densely packed here. So that's kind of the exception to the rule in terms of connective tissue. The cells are pretty densely packed together in this type of tissue. Let me point out a couple things of interest to you. So first of all, this is the cell right there, and you can see very clearly the plasma membrane, and most of that cell is filled up with this white space, and that's the triglycerides. This is the nucleus of that cell, and all the other nuclear organelles, I should say, are pushed off to the edge. So the entire cell is filled up with this adipose tissue. And if you recall back to our discussion in terms of the difference between males and females in the terms of the amount of water that each of them carries in the body, and we notice that females tend to have less, smaller volume of water than males, and this is the reason. So there is less intracellular fluid in females because they have more adipose tissue, and the cells that make up that adipose tissue are filled with this triglyceride vesicle, and there's no real space for there to be a lot of water inside the cell. It's because most of that cell is filled up with that droplet of fat. You also see some blood vessels here. So this is a highly vascular tissue. You can see that here in the drawing. Okay. So this is a typical view of adipose tissue. All right. The next type of tissue that we want to look at is dense regular connective tissue. Dense regular connection. And that's actually at the bottom of the page here. So dense regular connective tissue. Let's talk a little bit about the terminology. Dense, regular. Those two terms are have meaning and should be paid attention to. So dense means just exactly what it says. There are a lot of fibers. So lots of fibers. Very densely packed with fibers. Okay. And the word regular means they all run in the same direction. They're all lined up parallel to each other. So a lot of fibers densely packed together, and all of them running in the same direction. Like this. That would be an example of dense regular connective tissue. Let's take a look at the image. So here is a nice image of that. In this, and we'll see this in the next session. I will do the same thing as I did with epithelial tissue. I'll come back with a lot of images. We'll talk about them as we go through the images. But one of the things that I key in on when I'm looking at this is this term, a river of worms. So if you see, these are the cells. These are the fibroblasts. And then these are the fibers. These are the fibers. And you can see they're very densely packed together. They're all running in the same direction. They're not crisscrossing. They're all parallel to each other. And with the dark fibroblasts that are scattered about it looks like a sea in which there's a whole series of worms that are just kind of swimming along in a parallel direction. And then that's why I call it the river of worms, because there's a lot of these dark little slashes. And when you look at the entire view under a microscope, hopefully it does remind you of that. It certainly does to me. Why are all the fibers lined up in this direction? Why aren't they crisscrossed? Because in this area, or where this is found, in the part of the body where this type of tissue is found, the stress is coming from a single direction. So you're going to line up the fibers in the direction in which that tissue is being pulled. So if it's only being pulled in one direction, you want all the fibers to line up in that direction along the long axis of the pull. And so typically tendons, which is connective tissue that attaches muscle to bone, you're going to see those tendons being dense, regular connective tissue. Okay. Then we get to another type of dense tissue, but this is dense, irregular connective tissue. So we know what the word dense means. What do we mean when we say irregular? Well, just the opposite of regular. So in this case, the fibers are going to be crisscrossing one another. They're not going to be all lined up in the same direction. They're going to have this kind of pattern. And why would that be the case? Because in this type of tissue, the stress, the lines of stress, is not coming from a single direction or in a single direction, it's from multiple directions. And so you have to align the fibers in multiple directions in order to take on that stress. So when we talk about dense regular connective tissue, what we're looking at is something like this. Okay. So there's an example. And see, the fibers are not all parallel. They're kind of crisscrossing, although they don't do a very good job of showing you that here. But they are running in multiple directions. And here, in the case that they're showing us, is the dermis. So the skin that you can see on the surface is called the epidermis, above the dermis. And that's the skin that you normally think about when you think about skin. But underneath that is a very thick area called the dermis. And in that area, we have dense, irregular connective tissue. Think about the stress that your skin is under constantly. It's not being pulled in a single direction. It's being pulled in multiple directions all the time. And as a result, you want the fibers to be arranged in multiple directions to accommodate that stretching. You would also see this surrounding blood vessels. You'd see this in the walls of blood vessels because they experience the same kind of thing. The stress is not coming in one direction, but multiple directions as the blood vessel expands, for example, due to increased pressure, blood pressure. So this is your dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay. Finally, the last type of tissue, actually, is it the last type? I think it is. No, I don't think it is. So finally, the last type of connective tissue that we're going to look at in the lab is cartilage. Now, there are 3 different types of cartilages that we find in the human body. This is the most abundant. So let me back up for a second. Why did I pick these particular types of connective tissue? Because these are the ones that you're going to most often be talking about in this class and in the following 2 classes. So there are a lot of different types of connective tissue. The ones that you talk about most often are the ones that we're looking at in this lab. And if you're going to run into something, a connective tissue that you're going to discuss a lot, there will be a whole chapter devoted to it. So, for example, there's a whole chapter devoted to blood, which is a connective tissue. It's a form of connective tissue. So you're going to get a lot of information later on, more specific information later on for those types of connective tissues, which you have to have a lot of detail and knowledge about. So we're focusing here on cartilage. Of the 3 major types of cartilage, this is the most abundant type. And let me go ahead and show you an image of that. So cartilage, and hyaline cartilage, to be specific, is found in a number of places. So your nose, that's hyaline cartilage. Okay. The ends of long bones, there's a number of places that we find hyaline cartilage in abundance. The ribs are connected to the sternum using hyaline cartilage. In this case, they're using the fetus because there are many bones in the body that begin, in terms of their development, as a cartilage model, and then that cartilage model is replaced by actual bone tissue. And so that's why they're using that as a particular example. So what you're going to see is this kind of bluish haze, and then these circle-like structures in the cartilage. And if you look over here at the drawing, what you're looking at is this is the extracellular material. Now you do not see the fibers. They're there, but they are not visible under the microscope, even though they're present. What you see is mostly this purplish kind of view of the cartilage. And then these islands within that matrix, and inside those islands are living the cells that produce this matrix. And these cells are called chondrocytes. Okay, and they're living inside these little caves within the cartilage itself. Now remember, cartilage was the exception in 2 situations: lack of blood and lack of nerves. And so one of the reasons that cartilage takes such a long time to repair itself is because all these cells that are responsible for the repair and maintenance of the extracellular material, they're trapped within that matrix. No blood vessels. All the blood vessels are out at the edge. Okay, and so diffusion is being used to get the nutrients into these cells and to get rid of waste. And that's a very slow process. So these cells are metabolically are not metabolically active, I should say. And so it takes a while for cartilage to repair itself for that reason. Okay? So this is a hyaline cartilage. Now, the image that I like to think about, the term that I use when talking about this is Jimi Hendrix. And you're probably wondering, well, first of all, you might be wondering who the heck is Jimi Hendrix, in which case I feel sorry for you. But if you know who Jimi Hendrix is, you might know that he did a song called Purple Haze. This tends to be a purplish color, and hence, purple haze, Jimi Hendrix. That's just the way my mind works. Sorry about that. So these little islands, or these little caves, if you will, are called lacunae. Lacunae, and that's where these cells live. They're actually trapped within the matrix. So that's the only type of connective tissue we'll be looking at the lab. We'll investigate that further, of course, in the lecture. All right, let me finish up with the remaining two types of connective tissues. So we talked about epithelial tissue. We just finished a discussion on connective tissue. There are two left in terms of tissues, and that's muscle tissue. And muscle tissue comes in three forms or types. Number one, skeletal muscle tissue. Number two, smooth muscle tissue. That's an M, believe it or not. And number three, cardiac. And there, cardiac muscle tissue. So we spend a whole chapter talking mostly about skeletal muscle tissue. There's a whole chapter on cardiac muscle tissue. We don't give smooth muscle tissue much discussion, unfortunately, and really that's mostly just because of the time factor. We're going to talk a little bit about it more in lecture, but we're going to really focus on skeletal muscle tissue when we talk about muscle tissue. This in 40A, smooth muscle kind of gets the short end of the stick. So let's just comment. I'm just going to show you some images and discuss while I'm showing them to you how you can distinguish between the various types of muscle tissue. So first we'll start off with skeletal muscle tissue, and here we are. And before we go any further, this question has always been asked, and it's always kind of embarrassing to me when students ask this question, but I want to get it out of the way so that I don't have to answer this question over and over again. Yes, this is a picture of me. They have used me as a model to draw this image right here. So, yes, it's like I say, it's kind of embarrassing, but I try to keep my shirt on. But I'm sure that you noticed the similarity between that drawing and me. So, getting back to skeletal muscle tissue, one of the things that you're going to see is that, first of all, there are multiple nuclei in the cell. So more than one nuclei. They are long cylindrical cells, and they have this pattern of dark and light, dark and light, dark and light. That's called striations. Striations. And that's due to the type of protein arrangement within the cell. We'll discuss that and get into that when we are looking at muscle tissue, which is the last chapter we cover in this quarter. So obviously, skeletal muscle tissue is attached mostly to the skeletal system. It moves the skeletal system. It's not always the case, mostly the case. So there are some muscles that are attached to other muscles. There are some muscles that are attached to soft tissue. But for the most part, they're attached to the skeletal system. They're voluntary. That means you can control them. You can decide when to shorten these muscles. So this is the most abundant type of muscle tissue in your body, skeletal muscle tissue. The second one on our list was smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is found in a variety of places. For example, there is a layer of smooth muscle tissue around arteries. And the reason it's there is because we can control the size of the lumen by activating or relaxing these muscles. So when these muscles are contracting, the size of the artery is reduced. When they're relaxed, the size of the artery can be increased. And we can control blood pressure, for example, in the body by changing the diameter of blood vessels. And we can also direct blood flow within the body by changing the diameter of certain arteries. It's not the only place. So the uterus is, the wall of the uterus is composed of smooth muscle. There's a layer of smooth muscle, in fact, several layers of smooth muscle that line the digestive tract. So a number of places within the body. So unlike skeletal muscle, you don't see striations. Unlike skeletal muscle, we have a sort of worm-like shape to the cell and a single nucleus. So there is quite a bit of difference between this smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, and I think you can see it's quite dramatic. Smooth muscle is designed for long, sustained contractions. It doesn't fatigue very easily. Skeletal muscle tends to fatigue quite quickly. Smooth muscle will hold a contraction for an extended period of time without fatiguing. It can produce a very strong contraction, as anybody who's given birth can testify, but it's designed for a long, sustained contraction without fatiguing. So this is smooth muscle. And of course, the final type of muscle tissue that we see is found only in the heart. And this is cardiac muscle tissue. As soon as it comes into focus, there we go. And it's somewhat similar to skeletal muscle in that you see the striations, not as strongly, but they're there. And you can see them more clearly in the drawing itself. Okay. We also have typically a single nucleus, although it's not unusual to find a cell with more than one nuclei, but that's not the rule. It's more the exception. And they're branched. The cells are branched. So there's not a cylindrical shape, but they're branching. And they have a very specialized connection between two cells, as you can see right here. This is called the intercalated disc. And that disc is we'll talk about. In fact, you'll talk about it quite a lot in 40B when you do heart tissue or when you study the heart. That's a very specialized junction between two cells and it has some very special characteristics which the heart cells need in order to function properly. It's called the intercalated disc, and you can see there some right there. There's some here and here, these dark lines that you see right here. So you get the nucleus, you get the striations. Hard to see in the actual drawing, as you'll see when we look at some of the slides. It'll be difficult to see it too, but they are branched. And you'll just have to probably take my word for it or the textbook word for it because it's not easy to see in a mass of tissue like you see here. Okay. All right, so that's muscle tissue, and the last type of tissue that we find in the human body is nervous tissue. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this at all in this quarter. You're going to have a whole chapter devoted to nervous tissue, and typically that's the first chapter you talk about in 40B. But I will say two things about it. Number one, we have two different types of cells. So we have the neuron, which most people associate with the nervous system. That's this very large cell that you see right here. And then we have another set of cells called neuroglia cells. And you don't hear much about them, but they're as important as the neurons. Without the neuroglia cells, the neurons would not function. And you will learn all about their functions and what they do and how they support the neurons in their functioning when you get into that chapter. So that's just a quick view of nervous tissue. So thank you very much. I will be posting pretty shortly the follow-up, the identification that I did, as you saw with the epithelial tissue, and then this part of the lab will be done. So see you in a moment, and I'll talk to you later.